This video covers what we call the Last West. The Last West will overlap with other different eras that we've studied already, but it's going to talk about the last portion of westward expansion to the western half of the United States. So let's get back to the closing of the West of the frontier. What does frontier mean? In a sense, we're talking about land that's not been explored or developed. For Americans in the 1800s, the West was that last frontier. We're going to learn today that issues arose as America extended westward to the Pacific Ocean. We call the region between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains the Great Plains. Most of the Great Plains is going to be a vast grassland. It's home to many animals and people, and it can sustain life. This particular presentation is going to talk about the obstacles of settlement of this particular region. You've probably seen this painting before, especially in 8th grade. This is a painting called American Progress. This painting represents the idea of manifest destiny, our God-given right to settle North America. You're going to see a mixture of government support and individualism as the West is settled. In his paper known as The Significance of the Frontier in American History, Frederick Jackson Turner will describe how the 19th century West was a place where rugged individualism flourished and replenished American democracy. This is known as Turner's frontier thesis. In this thesis, he states that land promoted independence, liberty, and individualism. The challenges of the frontier are going to make Americans more practical and inventive. Think about it. Living in the West is more difficult, and if you don't figure out a way to live, you're just going to die. So Americans really became tougher and stronger, smarter because of the West. Americans moved westward for many reasons, but a common theme was the chance for a better life. That if you put in the hard work, you can make a new life for yourself and your family. Going back to the painting, if you look at the right side of the painting, it's lighter. That's going to symbolize civilization. If you look at the left side, that's going to be darker, uncivilized, unknown. You see Native Americans, the buffalo, miners, pioneers heading westward. The woman floating in the air kind of symbolizes hope, technology, civilization. She's bringing knowledge, technology with her. If you remember back in 8th grade, 1848 was a gold rush in California. That's going to lead to a series of rushes throughout the West. Remember that anybody moving to California in 1849 to look for gold was known as a 49er. That's where you get the NFL mascot for the San Francisco 49ers. You're going to see this happen throughout the West. Anytime gold or silver is discovered in a region, a boom town will develop, and when that precious metal is gone, the town will disappear. The 1848 gold rush is directly responsible for the California statehood. Their population shot up so quickly they were able to apply for statehood in 1 year. You'll see similar rushes in Nevada in 1859, Colorado. 1876, you'll see gold found in South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. In 1896, gold was discovered in a Klondike region of Alaska. Now, during this period, our currency was based on the gold standard. That means that for each dollar, there was X amount of gold that backed it up. The government could only print as much money as we had in gold. Well, we were going through an economic downturn, a periodic depression in 1893, and the Klondike Gold Rush was able to get the country out of the depression because our money supply went up. How are Americans supposed to get out west? What do we need to build to make it easier to get goods and people from the East Coast to the West Coast? Well, we need a transcontinental railroad. In 1862, Congress passes the Pacific Railways Act. It promotes the construction of a railroad from the east to the west. It will do this through the issuing of government bonds and grants of land to railroad companies. Remember, we already had a vast network of trains in the east. We just needed to connect it. The government grants two companies permits to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific begins in Omaha, Nebraska, and will work west. The Central Pacific will start in Sacramento, California, and work east. They finally met on May 10, 1869, in Promontory Point, Utah. Travel between the two coasts was now a matter of days rather than weeks or months.
Let's look at the impact of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad facilitated easier and cheaper travel between the two coasts. If you look at the map on the top left of the slide, if you wanted to travel from New York to California before the Transcontinental Railroad, it would take you 6 months and cost you over $1,000. After the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, it's a 1 week travel time with a cost of about $150. The Transcontinental Railroad also created a production boom. Resources now had a faster way to be transported from one coast to the other. Over $50 million worth of goods were transported every year on the Transcontinental Railroad. In addition, businesses now had improved access to information and skills. As mail and people moved more quickly, information can travel quickly over the Transcontinental Railroad as well.
Here you can see that by the end of the 1800s, there were several transcontinental railroads connecting east and west. The areas in pink showed land granted to railroad companies to build the railroad. Any unused land was sold to Americans interested in moving westward. Many major cities grew up along the railroad, the most notable being Denver, one of the few major U.S. cities not situated along a waterway. While Americans settled the West, cities were growing in the East. We will discuss this in the next unit on the Gilded Age. As those urban populations grew, there was an increased demand for food. Increased demand for beef causes the prices of cattle to go up. Texas ranchers will see this as an opportunity to sell their cattle in Missouri and Kansas. But how can they get their cattle to the Midwest without a southern railroad?
This map shows you Western railroads and cattle trails in the western United States in the 1870s. It shows you the three major cattle trails. Cowboys on horses had to escort herds of cattle from Texas to trains in Kansas in what are known as cattle drives. The most famous cattle drive is known as the Chisholm Trail, that started in San Antonio in southern Texas and moved north to Abilene, Kansas.